This jail holds a dark secret. In 1942, His Majesty's Prison Shepton Mallet was taken over by the US military authorities. They built a small red brick extension. It was an execution chamber. In an army that was 90% white, over half of the 18 men hanged here were black. In a country where rape was not a capital offence, it became one for black GIs who served in England.
There was probably a shadow of a doubt in every case. There was hardly a fair trial. And I'm sitting here today, 57 years later, and I feel certain that there were probably an equal number of whites that committed the crime, but were never prosecuted, and as a result were never executed. They were all blacks.
No mistake was ever made. There was no argument. Not one prisoner said, "I didn't do it, you got the wrong guy." They all did it.
Or did they? In the case of one black soldier, more than 33,000 English people thought otherwise.
I think that the chap was wrongly accused, and if local people hadn't stood up and be counted, that chap would have either been hung in Shepton Mallet or shot.
Black and white US servicemen were also hanged for murder, all by an English hangman on English soil in the name of the American Army.
Over there, send the word, over there, that the Yanks are coming.
Between 1942 and 1945, Britain was invaded by 1.5 million American servicemen.
Send the word to beware. We'll be all
2,000 were based here, with the 466th Bombardment Group, at a US airbase near Attlebridge, not far from Norwich in East Anglia. Amongst them was Private George E. Smith. Although not one of America's brightest, he was regarded as harmless by his comrades in arms.
The word I use is a simpleton. He should have never been in the service. He wasn't mentally fit. He was a child.
One afternoon, Smith trespassed onto the nearby estate of Sir Eric and Lady Teichman.
Rabbits were plentiful all over the place. There were other different forms of animal life, and I couldn't even begin to name what was there. And it was common practice for American airmen or GIs to take a pot shot. So George Smith thought that going out and shooting a squirrel or shooting a rabbit was perfectly all right.
Inside Lord and Lady Teichman's house was 17-year-old Doris Stickland, daughter of Sir Eric's chauffeur.
Sir Eric heard a shot, and as they had been troubled with poachers, he thought he'd go out and investigate and see what it was all about. And then, of course, when he didn't return, people began to get a bit worried and concerned.
A search party went out to look for him. As darkness fell, his wife became more and more anxious.
Well, of course, you don't rest. If you can't, your husband hasn't come home, you don't rest till you find him, really. And she was all on edge, and that's why my father went out with her again, late at night in the woods, and they found him in the undergrowth.
Teichman had been shot through the head. Suspicion fell on the GIs at the neighbouring airbase, where George Smith was stationed. The next day a gun inspection was ordered. One of the men at the airbase said he had seen Smith hunting the day before. Smith was charged and confessed immediately. This police reconstruction at the scene of the crime shows Smith helping MPs, military police, to retrace his steps in the woodland. He told the police that when he saw an old man approaching, he let off one shot from the hip. Nevertheless, Smith was charged with the willful and premeditated murder of Eric Teichmann with malice aforethought.
In fact, we talked about it so many times over there. We said, how in the hell could that have happened? It was a freak shot. It was a freak accident. But he did it. So it came out he murdered him. He didn't murder him. He had, to me, and to those of us who were talking about it at that time, it happened, but we didn't think it was murder.
3 days after the shooting, on the 6th of December 1944, the body of Sir Eric was laid to rest in the village churchyard. Smith spent Christmas in jail, awaiting his court-martial. During that time, he was assessed by psychiatrists to determine his mental state. The trial records of all the US servicemen executed in Britain have been studied by Professor Bob Lilly.
Well, the court records indicate that there were 2 examinations of Smith, one by a British doctor and the other examination by American doctors. The British doctor concluded that he was not fit to be able to plead guilty or not guilty. The American doctor said that he had a mental age of 9, that he was schizophrenic and psychotic, and they allowed the trial to go forward anyway.
These are the first minutes of a general court-martial. The accused is a soldier. But
when his trial began on January 8, 1944, Smith pleaded not guilty due to insanity. But the prosecution argued he was a cancerous growth upon this world's face, and it is the duty of the court to remove that cancer.
He is.
It appears that the court is properly constituted. You may call the court to order whenever you're ready. The court will come to order.
The 11 officers judging the case agreed with the prosecution. Smith was found guilty and sent to Shepton Mallet to await execution. Aware that her husband's killer was facing the death penalty, Lady Teichmann wrote an extraordinary letter, which was passed to the American ambassador in London.
The law is hard, and it seems awful to me that a young man should be forced into eternity. Could one do anything to help him? Eric was so forgiving. I know he would have wanted as much leniency as possible.
She thought one life was bad enough without having somebody else to lose another life over it. So she was always very adamant about that. She didn't want him to die.
Lady Teichmann's plea for mercy was ignored, and on VE Day, 8th of May 1945, the day the Allies celebrated victory in the war against Nazi Germany, and euphoric crowds cheered in Piccadilly Circus, Private George E. Smith took his lonely walk to the gallows. A man with a mental age of 9 made one parting gesture before the noose was tightened around his neck.
A 9-year-old waved bye-bye to people. You know, they waved bye-bye. And that's what he did. He waved bye-bye to people. He just waved bye-bye, and that was the end of it. That was the end of George Smith.
Even before their troops arrived in Britain, the Americans were worried about maintaining law and order in a foreign land. In August 1942, Parliament passed the Visiting Forces Act, giving American military authorities legal jurisdiction over their soldiers, even with crimes committed against British citizens. But there were some reservations. Tom Dryburgh MP asked Churchill to inform the US military that the colour bar is not a custom of this country. Aware that around 10% of GIs were black, and that the majority of American states practiced racial segregation, he was worried that this system was being imported into Britain by the US military.
The Army was totally segregated. There was the only white people in my outfit were the officers. The officers were all white.
Most of them was from the South, understand, and most of my outfit was from the South, and we were segregated. And when we got there, we stayed in separate barracks from the white. You couldn't eat with them. They had to have 2 mess halls all the time, and that's the way it was all the way until 1945.
Segregation became a great source of tension between black American troops and their white officers in England, as Charlie Kirsch remembers from his unit.
Numbers of the black troops broke under the stress. The white officers slept with guns under their pillows. Of course, they felt that the men at some times were close to mutiny.
From the segregated southern town of Dothan, Alabama, in January 1942, this segregated army found another recruit. He was 20-year-old David Cobb, the son of a Baptist preacher. He arrived in Britain in December 1942. Within 3 months, he was dead, leaving behind a widow, son, and a daughter who was 2 years old.
I always wondered why. I always wondered what happened to him. And I always wondered if maybe he was still alive and someday he would show up, because I wanted a father.
Just 13 days after his arrival in Britain, on December 27, 1942, Cobb was on guard duty near the entrance to an ordnance depot in Desborough, Northamptonshire.
Private Cobb went to bed and was awakened 3 or 4 hours later and told to get on guard duty. And he did. He was tired, he was hungry, and he was disheveled.
At 11 in the morning, a Lieutenant Cobner berated Cobb for his appearance and ordered that he be removed from his post.
Cobb claimed he had been trained not to give up his gun and to be taken off of guard duty unless the person who was going to replace them was present at the same time. There was no such person.
According to Cobb's statement, Lieutenant Cobner started advancing towards him.
The lieutenant made a fast step toward me, and I said, "Halt." And he said, "Soldier, give me that gun." And he reached for my gun, and when he reached for my gun, I shot him.
Cobb was charged with murder and tried 10 days later. His counsel referred to the incident as an accident, but never called any witnesses to back this up.
No one followed up on how well or even if Private Cobb had been trained to use the rifle that was in his possession at the time. He said at the trial that he had not been trained to use the gun that was given to him, and that contributed to the accident. In fact, he said he had to ask someone before he went on guard duty how to operate this particular rifle. His defense attorney did not develop that idea at all.
Although he was facing the death penalty, Cobb's trial lasted just 1 day. He was sentenced to death on the 6th of January 1943 and taken to Shepton Mallet, where he was executed on the 12th of March. For 15 years, his daughter Christine was shielded by her mother from the truth about how he died.
Maybe it was for the best I didn't know all of this stuff until now. I wonder would I have been able to handle it.
When Christine was 8 years old, Cobb's corpse was exhumed and brought back to Dothan for reburial. His body was buried in an unmarked grave close to his parents.
I would just like to see it cleared up. I really would. I would like to see his name cleared. If it actually was an accidental shooting, then it should be cleared. And I would like to see it before I die.
Private Cobb was the first black American soldier to be executed on British soil in World War II. His was a crime committed by one American soldier against another. Far more sinister cases were to emerge with sex crimes against the local population.
They used to call him Lazy Bones in Harlem. Lazy, good for nothing all the day. But now they're mighty proud of him in Harlem. Chocolate soldier from the USA.
In 1943, the U.S. Army's Colonel Plank wrote a memorandum outlining that black soldiers, generally, cannot be trusted to tell the truth, to execute complicated orders, or to act on their own initiative. Most black GIs were not regarded as worthy of being fighting troops, a role largely reserved for white men. This had some advantages in Britain.
They had to go and fight. You know, they didn't have the luxury that we had because of segregation. So segregation worked in our favor. They wouldn't let us, they didn't trust us to go up on the front line and fight, so they kept us back there. So naturally, we stayed in one area for maybe a year and a half. And you get to know the people, and you go to the pubs, and you meet, and you buy drinks, and they buy drinks, and they play darts, and just and go to the dances.
A British fellow told me one day that you guys are here, and you're protecting us in England, and you deserve for us to respect you for doing that. And you look just like everybody else to me who's here in American uniform, and I'm not going to discriminate against you. And that sums it up. That's exactly what was going on. That gave me the sense that I was in a different environment. I never had a relationship with any white woman in the U.S. Never. Because history was that, you know, most of the black men who were lynched because of having some relationship with a white female. And those lynchings left an indelible mark on all of us as to who we would deal with. So you just would avoid having anything to do with a white female. Even if she wanted to be kind, you just weren't going to do it because you could lose your life doing it. And so here we are in England where you don't lose your life.
Well, I didn't see any restrictions in the UK, but having come from Mississippi and gone over from Mississippi to England, and then we would go to dances and things like that, that when we would dance, naturally there was nobody else to dance but the white girls, and I was scared to death for a while. I was shaking and shivering, but anyway, I got over that.
For many white GIs, the racial integration in Britain came as a shock. It was something that Pat Spavin, who served in the Land Army, soon noticed.
I think they thought we were all crazy because we didn't seem to mind black people. We weren't used to colour bars and racial prejudice and things like that.
Never get those things right. Well, goodbye, ma'am.
Goodbye. It's been very nice meeting you both.
Glad to have met you, I'm sure.
Funny you should come from Birmingham, too, isn't it? Have you come to my Birmingham, you come to my home and have a cup of tea with me, both of you.
Thank you, we will.
Goodbye and good luck.
Goodbye. Bye-bye.
The American military was so worried about the situation, information films had to be made explaining the difference in attitude.
Now look, men, you heard that conversation. That's not unusual here. It's the sort of thing that happens quite a lot. Now let's be frank about it. There are colored soldiers as well as white here, and there are less social restrictions in this country. Just what you heard, an English woman asking a colored boy to tea. She was polite about it, and he was polite about it. Now, look, that might not happen at home, but the point is we're not at home. And the point is, too, if we bring a lot of prejudices here, what are we going to do about them?
Films like this were aimed at soldiers like Emmett Bailey. A non-commissioned officer from North Carolina, like many white Southerners, he felt uncomfortable about the sexual contact between races he witnessed in England.
In the moonlight of night, in most every doorway is standing a black American soldier with a white English woman. They're having intercourse in the standing position.
They were absolutely furious if they saw a black soldier with a white girl. And that, of course, is what caused the bother. Because they weren't used to white girls in America being friendly with black men.
On the way back, we encounter a tremendous fight between blacks and white American soldiers. One of those whites, I'll say, he's from the state of Georgia, and I'm not going to tell you his name, but I know his name and rank and serial number, was very good with a switchblade. All of a sudden, everything became very quiet. No more fighting. Those around scattered. And lying on the cobblestone street in a pool of blood is this black soldier, his throat cut from ear to ear, and he's dead. There was no charges brought against anybody. Weeks and months went by, and nothing was said. I think it was just treated as an accident. And the reason it was treated that way is because, see, the black companies of soldiers had white officers.
In 1943, General Devers affirmed that African Americans were to be brought under control by imposing heavy punishments for major crimes, sex crimes, and other natural propensities of colored men. In Marlborough, the discipline of black troops became a major concern to the segregated U.S. military when a horrific attack took place on September 28, 1943, just outside the town. George Browning was walking home from the cinema with a local girl.
When we came out of pictures, bearing in mind this was wartime, it was completely blacked out, pitch black. All you had was torches, hand torches. We made our way up the hill towards the hospital. And just before we went round the bend of the road, I heard this bang bang and a screech. And I said to the young lady with me that it sounds as though the Americans are in the forest shooting the deer. As we got round the bend in the road, the torch lit up the kitchen maid laying face down in the road.
To his horror, the victim was a girl who worked alongside him in the hospital.
The blood was still running down the road, and it was hissing, as it does, you know, if somebody bleeds profusely like that. I've seen it in the army. It sort of hisses. I didn't move her, so I don't know exactly where the bullets went in or anything. I mean, I just felt the pulse to see if she was alive or dead.
And what did the pulse tell you?
Dead.
George Browning ran to the hospital to sound the alarm. Local GP, Dr. Morris, was on call that night and rushed to the scene of the crime.
I was shocked because I knew the girl, and she was just one of the hospital staff. I saw her every day, and it was a terrible shock to see her lying there with bullets in her back. In those days, once the blackout fell, there was virtually no traffic, and she wasn't moved for a long time because the police were insistent that they must leave the body untouched until photographers had come from Devizes to take pictures.
But the dead kitchen maid was not the only victim. She had been out with a friend who was still missing. Locals searched in vain. Then, just after midnight, the friend staggered out of the forest.
She arrived at the hospital in a state of extreme distress and explained what had happened and where it had happened. I just do remember that she was in a real state of distress.
Did you conduct any kind of medical examination?
Yeah, well, I examined her to establish the fact that she had been raped, which I was able to do.
The girl told the police the rape and the murder had been committed by a black GI.
This is the area where the incident occurred. Well, he was obviously in the edge of the forest here where all these trees are, and it was thick like that. And we think afterwards that the reason he shot her was because of the size of her and the fact she was struggling. He couldn't have never have got her into that forest, two of them at the same time.
But on the night in question, as the rapist pulled his victim through the barbed wire at the roadside, he had left a vital clue: a US Army forage cap. The nearest black unit was stationed here, half a mile away. The 248th Quartermaster Battalion at Iron Gates Camp in Savernake Forest. A bed check was made just after the crime took place. One man was absent. Private Lee Davis. His bed was unmade. On his return, he was arrested. It looked like an open and shut case.
The circumstantial evidence looked very good because Davis wasn't in his bunk when he was supposed to be there, and later when they did find him, he was wearing blood-stained shorts, and some of his clothes were missing at the time, and there was no other obvious explanation for why he had blood-stained shorts on, and with seminal fluids on them. And he was supposed to be in his bed.
A blood-stained coat and a pair of trousers, which appeared to be his, were also found near his barracks. When interrogated, Davis confessed,
"I wasn't in my right mind then, and it was an accident, because I thought I had the gun in the air. All I ask is, will you spare my life? I am sorry I did what I did, but I know it won't bring back the girl's life, and I am sorry. I want all the Christians to pray for me."
The Lee Davis case involved exactly what the American forces were concerned about, that is, a black soldier raping a white woman. It was the kind of case that produced a lot of concern about what the Army would do and could do and should do. It was the first rape case which went to trial involving a murder. The U.S. Army was under considerable pressure for public relations reasons as well as for disciplinary reasons to act quickly, to make a decision, and to punish the soldier.
Davis had virtually no time to prepare his defense. Just 7 days after the crime was committed, he was brought to trial at Tottenham House in Savernake Forest. Dr. Morris and George Browning took the stand for the prosecution.
What I do remember about the courtroom was when they finally brought this accused chap in. He was between four enormous great MPs, their white helmets and white belts, mangled hands and feet like the Americans do. And he was like Joe Louis the boxer. He was big, 21, about 6'6", and muscular. and they brought him down the aisle, and the MP was brushing against me, so the actual accused chap wasn't that far from me, and that really, really frightened me at that stage, you know. I mean, knowing that he was mangled and that, but to see that and to think that he was the one that was being accused of doing it really set the hair on the back of my neck.
But as the court-martial opened, doubts immediately emerged about the foundations of the prosecution's case. Lee Davis retracted his confession, saying he had been tricked into writing it. Then his unit supply sergeant testified that the trousers presented as evidence in court were not the ones he had issued to Private Davis.
When Davis attempted to try on the trousers in court, they were too small. They didn't fit. They were the wrong trousers for Davis. This was not at all inconsistent with other parts of the case. The case involved a lot of circumstantial evidence, involved a hat, it involved a coat, it involved trousers, but this was all circumstantial evidence. There was not one piece of forensic evidence that connected Davis to the case, including the rifle that was used to kill the companion of the woman he was accused of raping. There was no forensic evidence at all.
More worrying still, in spite of being examined by Dr. Morris and a colleague as to her fitness to testify, the surviving witness was not asked to give evidence identifying the perpetrator, either outside or inside the courtroom.
But there was no question anyway that she was mentally fit enough.
Well, there obviously had been a question, although you wouldn't have asked us to go and examine her, but no, I think everyone was quite satisfied that she was perfectly fit to go.
No record exists in the case file explaining why she was not asked to give identification evidence.
Was he dealt with fairly? I mean, there's not a witness who's involved in the crime, including the victim, that says, he's the one. No one comes forward and really hammers him at all. You also get the impression from reading the case it's kind of edgy and it's kind of not tight. The prosecution can't come up with witnesses that really hammer him on anything, and the sergeant who gave him his clothes says these aren't the right clothes, and they don't fit.
It seemed to me that it was all sort of push, push, push to get it done and dusted. And as far as I'm aware, I don't know if there is anything in detail. Never heard of an appeal or anything. I think he was found guilty, taken down there, and that was it. Bang. Next thing we heard, he'd been hung.
Despite inconsistencies in the evidence, the court-martial found Private Lee Davis guilty of both murdering one woman and raping another. He was hanged at Shepton Mallet on the 14th of December, 1943.
Somewhere over there for Uncle Sammy, chocolate soldier from the USA.
Most British people regarded the manner and bearing of black GIs as a welcome relief from 5 dreary years of war. But the American military authorities were becoming increasingly concerned. On March the 5th, 1944, in a small village near Cheltenham called Bishop's Cleeve, a 16-year-old local girl was walking home with her white American boyfriend, Private Edward J. Heffernan.
The circumstances are that it's nighttime. The female is a teenager with an American soldier, and they are put upon by 2 soldiers. two black American soldiers.
The girls' story was that they were walking back from the pub when they were assaulted. Her boyfriend got away, and whilst he ran to get help, the two soldiers carried her over a gate and onto the banks of a nearby brook. She claimed they then took it in turns to rape her. Investigations continued throughout the night, and boot prints were found at the scene of the crime. The following day, there was a boot inspection at the local American camp. After Rivali, two men were arrested. They were Private Elijah Brinson and Private Willie Smith.
There was very little evidence tying them to the case. In fact, there was just a footprint or two in the soil that was interpreted as being the same footprint that their boots would make.
There were major holes in the prosecution's case. Descriptions of the two GIs were contradictory. According to the girl, they were big-built fellows, but her boyfriend claimed they were of slender build. There was, however, an even greater problem with the girl's story.
There was no evidence from the medical personnel that she had been raped. And that's one of the interesting parts of this case. You have the boyfriend and the girl giving contradictory stories, and there's no physical evidence that a rape occurred.
Nevertheless, both men were charged with forcibly and feloniously against her will having carnal knowledge of the girl, and went on trial for their lives on April 29, 1944. Once again, there was no identification evidence.
In the Brinson and Smith case, the victim and her companion did not identify the accused. They were not identified in court. They were not identified prior to court.
Brinson and Smith were found guilty and dispatched to Shepton Mallet Prison to await execution. Milton Aspel was a dentist with the medical section of the military police battalion at Shepton Mallet. He saw condemned prisoners before they met their fate.
They had to be certified by a written report by the physician who did the examining, and he had to be in excellent health too, by the way. If he were sick in any way, it was postponed. But all the prisoners that we saw, they were in good health, all of them.
I can't tell the world about this. I can tell the nations are blessed. Tell them what Jesus.
Some of them sang spirituals. Some of them moaned incoherently. In fact, some asked for the chaplain. And in fact, one of the questions before they were actually hung, the chaplain said, "Is there anything you wanted to say to me?" And the commanding officer said the same thing. And 9 times out of 10, they had nothing to say.
Even though rape was not punishable by death under English law, the British government aided the Americans in their work by lending them the prison service hangmen Albert Pierpoint and his uncle Thomas.
The reason that we used Pierpoint as the executioner is we didn't have anyone in the U.S. Army who had any experience in doing any hanging. And we later developed a couple of people who did some executions, some not as efficient as Thomas and Albert Pierpoint, but they were official executioners, and they were ready to be hired and could be hired for a modest fee to carry out this duty. That made it very convenient.
To us, it was really just like a stranger that came in and had a job to do, like you hire an electrician or a carpenter for the first time. He did his job, and we respected him for it. he knew why he was there, and that was young, and he loved her.
About this, I can tell the nations are blessed.
In Coombe Down, near Bath, just 20 miles from where the executions were taking place, another rape was reported on the 5th of May 1944. But this case made waves that reached all the way up to the Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight Eisenhower.
A married woman with 2 children said that late at night a soldier had tapped on her window or door and said, "I need some directions to get back to some area." And she came out of her house. She had a coat on. She said she would walk with the soldier some way down the road to point him in the right direction. That's what she said. And she said that after they were out of the distance of the house and down the road a bit, that he then forcibly attacked her, threatening her with a knife if she did not comply, have sexual intercourse with him.
When her husband found her walking home, she broke down and said she had been raped. He took her to the local ambulance station where she reported the rape. The police were called, and on the way back she pointed out a black GI. He was Private Leroy Henry. When he was arrested and confessed, the case made the local paper, but the villagers were skeptical.
I was a milkman, and I used to deliver milk to the woman's house, so I knew exactly where she lived. And I also knew that her husband was a lorry driver, and he used to work away quite a bit, especially weekends. So I knew a bit about her. Well, she was a regular in the pub, and that's where she met Leroy, in the Cross Keys. They'd been out together a few times, so it wasn't the fact that it was an isolated case of picking on an innocent woman, because I say she was well known in the village. She'd been out with Leroy a few times, so...
Well, the reaction was that this wasn't on, really. This certain person, it was common knowledge, was letting her favours go out, some say for money, and this particular night the price went up, and this chap wouldn't agree to pay it, and she cried rape.
On the 25th of May 1944, Private Leroy Henry was brought before a general court-martial, held here at Nook Camp, Wiltshire. Like many other black defendants, he retracted his statement, saying it was fabricated. He maintained that he knew the woman and that they had had consensual sex.
We then came to a vacant field, and I helped her over the fence. She did not resist in any manner, and then with her right hand she pulled the left leg of her bloomers to the side, and I put my outfit in her.
His version of the case is that the woman was very familiar with him. She had met him on 2 or 3 previous occasions. She had responded to his question in the street one day if she could find him or direct him to find a good time girl. And he testified, she says, "You don't need to look any farther." And subsequently, they had intercourse on 2 or 3 occasions. He testified also that it was well known that she did this with American soldiers. And it's curious that the defense does not bring forth anyone who can testify to the fact that she is known locally as a loose woman. Or in terms of one person who said she was a bicycle. Everyone got a turn.
Once again, the trial was brief, just 1 day, and once again a black man was sentenced to death for rape. The village was outraged by the verdict. It was May 1944, and the whole country was preparing for D-Day. But the locals of Coombe Down were more concerned by the fate of Leroy Henry.
Well, the fear was that there was an injustice being done, and it shouldn't be. So I don't know who started getting out the petition, but it certainly gained in momentum, you know, because it went right down in the city of Bath.
At a paper shop in Coombe Down, a petition was started to plead for Leroy Henry's life. It was Pat Spaven's father's idea, and she signed and helped organize it.
Nobody had to be asked to sign. They all signed. They came into the shop. Where do I sign? Or if you asked anyone, they never said no. Because locally, it was known that the man was innocent. And it was a terrible miscarriage of justice.
Yeah, it didn't take me long to sign it at all.
Why did you sign it?
Well, because I thought there was, well, there was no, as far as I was concerned, there was no justice. The man was not guilty. It's pretty plain for anybody who knew the woman concerned and the circumstances that he just wasn't guilty.
Attached to the petition were also letters written by local people.
My neighbours and I have had no peace since we first read of this case.
Soldier, the sentence is unduly harsh and worthy of Nazi
I
barbarism.
beseech you to spare the Negro's life. The woman is a well-known bad lot. She ought to be charged with perjury and flogged. Surely his life is of far more value than even her word or her...
The petition itself was finished on the 8th of June 1944. It contained 33,132 signatures from people around Bath, and a covering letter from one of them.
We pray that this appeal will be successful. God bless you in your great task, and I hope that you can give a few moments for this.
It was sent to the Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight Eisenhower, on the 8th of June. His mind was somewhat preoccupied with other matters. D-Day. 2 days earlier, Allied armies had invaded France. Eisenhower's reaction shows how seriously he took what was developing into a public relations disaster for the US military. He responded to the petition with 6 simple words. The findings and sentence are disapproved.
Very surprising that, you know, a petition like that could sway the Supreme Commander of Allied Forces. But it did. So the power of the pen can be mighty.
Leroy Henry returned to his unit, his life saved by 33,000 white people he had never met. When the war ended, he returned to a United States that was as segregated as the one he had left. But the experience of living in a non-segregated society had changed many black GIs forever. On their return home, both Clarence Bolton and Paul Parks joined the civil rights movement.
But that's the kind of world we came back to, and with me, as I said, with the determination that I was going to do all I could to end the scourge of segregation in my own country. And it was England that taught me that, gave me the inspiration to do it.
Once you've been exposed to a new level of life, you ain't going back. And if you feel under the Constitution that you're entitled to this, then you're ready to stand up.
In 1948, the U.S. Army became the first American institution to desegregate. We approached the current Judge Advocate General concerning the convictions of the 5 men who were hanged and whose cases were investigated in this program. When asked whether these convictions were safe, the U.S. Army replied he would not comment on them.